Okay, hello everyone. You're tuned into today's PIR live event, and I'm your host for today, Scott Jones. Our guest today is Dr. Graydon Raymer, Associate Professor in the Bachelor of Physical Health and Education program at Nipissing University. Welcome to the live event, Dr. Raymer. Before we get started, I'd like also to welcome today's viewers who are watching the live stream. It's great to have you with us today. Remember that you can tweet your questions in at any time using the hashtag AskPIR throughout the live event. If there's room in your tweet, please include your name, school, or city so we can give you a shout out as well. So I'll get to those in just a minute, but first I'll turn it over to Dr. Raymer, who's going to tell us a bit about his background and also about the work that he does, which is very exciting. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Raymer.
Thank you, Scott. Welcome to everyone who's tuning in from all over Canada. I am up here in North Bay, Ontario at Nipissing University, and my lab here is the Exercise Physiology Lab. And this is where I conduct my research. This is where students in our program would come in their third and fourth year to take their lab courses and learn about how the human body exercises. And also where we have a grad program starting in September. We'll have grad students conducting research. My area is widely based on studying humans when they exercise. We look at the heart, we look at the lungs, we look at the muscles and how that works both with healthy people and also with people with certain disease conditions. But today we're going to talk about one specific area. We're going to talk about the heart. And this isn't a real heart. This is just a little model of a heart that I have. And if your heart would be right in the center of your chest here. I've got a little skeleton guy. And if you can make a fist, that's kind of roughly how big your heart is. So you can kind of imagine right in the middle of your chest, something about the size of your fist. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we study the heart and during exercise. And first, I just want to give you a quick little tour of some of the features here in the lab. You can see that we have a great big open area, and we have bikes, we have treadmills. I have one of my students who's also a cross-country runner standing on a treadmill. Her name is Katie. She's going to do a little demonstration for us in a minute. We have a really big treadmill over behind her that has cameras set up so we can study the movement of people running on the treadmill. Of course, we use things like skeletons and heart models. This little room back there, which kind of looks like a meat locker, sort of like what you would see at the back of a grocery store, comes from the same company that makes meat lockers. It can act like a freezer, so we can make it really cold. We can put people in there when they exercise and study how the body works in a cold climate. We can also make it really hot and simulate, a hot day in the summer. We can even change the oxygen level to simulate what it might be like for someone who's climbed up on top of a mountain and exercise. And we would move the bikes and the treadmills, and we put them all in that room. Now, Back to Katie here, and back to talking about the heart. I wonder if anyone out there can think of some of the things that change. Whoops, my heart almost fell apart here. Some of the things that change when you exercise with respect to the heart. And I know some of you, one of the first answers you might think of is your heart will beat faster. Your heart will increase. Your heart rate will pump. If you can imagine, it's like a little pump, and I can open it up and show you here. Inside the pump, it's hollowed out, and every time the heart beats it squeezes and pushes the blood out of it. And so if it pumps faster, it's going to pump more blood. And so we'll do a little test here with Katie and just see how much faster it would beat. Now, Katie she's got a little strap on her chest. It's underneath her shirt, but it's sending a little signal. Every time the strap detects her heart beating, her heart gives off a little bit of electricity. And we can measure it with our computer, and we can see how fast that heart is beating very quickly with exercise. If you don't have one of these systems, another easy way is you could measure your pulse, and that's what sometimes you see people will do when they put their fingers to your neck. And if you're sitting very still and you put your fingers up there, you can feel a little pulsing feeling. That's the blood gushing through the artery every time your heart beats. You can find the same thing on your wrist as well. You can feel that it's a little trickier to find on your wrist, but if you're careful and you're still, you'll find the little pulsing. Now, someone who's just sitting still, resting comfortably, maybe the heart is beating once every 50, 60, 70 times per minute. And there's a wide range. We consider normal anything really between the range of about 60 to 100 beats per minute. But let's see what happens when we get Katie exercising. So I'm going to turn the treadmill on. Are you ready, Katie?
Yes.
So let's get her up to a running speed here. So if you can see that I've got Katie running here, she's at about 12 kilometers an hour, which is not a super fast pace. Katie could probably keep this up for a little while, I think. But she's running at a good pace, and her heart rate, I'm going to turn so you can see the screen here on a computer. And so we've got the computer is measuring her heart rate. I'll make it a little bit bigger here so you can see it. And so we've gone from that resting heart rate of about, in her case, she was about 70 beats per minute at rest, to now we're up to 159 beats per minute. So it's almost doubled in rate. So you can imagine her little heart, which before was beating about this fast, but once every second, now it's beating twice per second. Her heart rate's coming down a little bit, and that's maybe because she's getting a little bit more comfortable with the speed she's running. The heart rate doesn't stay perfectly constant, right? It kind of bounces around a little bit. We could make her go a little bit faster, see if we can get her heart rate up higher. So we're going to go to 14 kilometers an hour. Here we go. Oh, the heart rate's getting up to 164. It dropped down. Because we're sending the signal wirelessly, the strap is sending it. Sometimes it misses a heartbeat, so the number drops a little lower. It's a very simple way to demonstrate. All right, we're not going to make Katie work too hard today, so I'm going to slow it down. I'm going to bring her back down to just a nice walk, let her cool down. The heart rate's probably going to stay elevated for a little bit. As soon as you exercise, your heart rate takes some time to increase, but then it's going to slowly come back down because we want to keep pumping the blood to the body. Now, one of the other things that changes, right, we look inside our heart again. Let me open it up. And you can see that there's these holes in the heart, and that's what opens up and fills up with blood, and then when the heart contracts, it squishes together and it sends the blood out the arteries to your muscles. Well, the heart can expand a little bit, and it can pump more blood when you need to send more blood. So not just going faster, you can imagine it also sending more volume. And the way that we can measure how much volume is being sent, this is tricky to do. You can't just look inside someone's heart. With techniques, you could have ultrasound that perhaps would look inside the heart. We don't have that set up here, but one of the techniques we use, and I'm going to get Katie to put in the mouthpiece. And so if you can see what she's done there, she's put in something that looks like the mouthpiece of a snorkel. And there's some little nose plugs that she can clip on. And then she's going to breathe through this machine for a little while. And what it is doing is it's measuring a couple things. It's measuring how much oxygen that is she's able to breathe in and into her body, and that oxygen is going to get absorbed into the blood of her lungs and pumped by her heart to the muscles. But we can also do something really neat. We can, through the tube that's pushing air into the mouthpiece, we can supply a gas that the body doesn't normally use. We might use a gas like acetylene, which it's called an inert gas. It doesn't absorb into your bloodstream. And a tricky way that we can actually find out how much blood is being pumped by the heart is, again, if you think of the heart, it has two sides. It has a left side, which is the bigger part of the heart, and it pumps all the blood to your muscles. And we have the right side of the heart. It's a little bit smaller, and it pumps blood just to your lungs. And through the machine, using the snorkel, we can look at a gas of acetylene. If we have Katie breathe in acetylene, we can measure the amount of time, essentially, that acetylene will get pumped by her lungs from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart. And if we measure how long that takes, we can get an estimate of how much blood is being pushed by the heart. Because that, unlike oxygen or carbon dioxide, the gas doesn't get lost in the bloodstream. Right? So it's kind of like if you're going to want to know how fast someone is driving a car from North Bay to Toronto, if you know what time they started at and what time they finished at, you could calculate the average speed that they travel. So that's a couple things there that we were able to measure. One, we've measured her heart rate, and she's about 122 here, so she's coming down. Maybe we lost a heartbeat there, but her heart rate is getting slower now. She's 99. We can measure the amount of blood being pumped with every heartbeat. A third thing that we can measure is the force that the heart. Every time the heart is a muscle. This dark red part here is the heart muscle, and when you're resting, right, the heart is just doing a gentle pump. And when it gets when you exercise, a good, strong, healthy heart has a very strong contraction, just like when you exercise and you lift a weight, your muscle contracts forcefully. And to measure that, we're gonna take Katie off the treadmill. I'll show you how we could maybe measure the force that the heart contracts. So Katie, you can take your mouthpiece out. And I'll stop the treadmill here. And then I'll ask Katie to come and have a seat on the chair here. And so if you've ever been to a doctor's office where they've taken your blood pressure, that's essentially measuring the force of the heart. And so to measure someone's blood pressure, we need this cuff that we're going to wrap around an arm. So we put it on the arm. I'll just get you to hold that for me. Hold this. And then normally a doctor would put a stethoscope on, and they're listening for a very specific sound. I'm gonna instead of using a stethoscope, I'm going to use a microphone that's attached to the computer here. And so I'm going to stick the microphone up underneath the cuff. And how blood pressure measurement works is I'm going to fill the cuff with air, and it's going to get really tight around her arm, so tight that it's actually going to stop the blood from getting past the cuff. We're going to close the artery, the little vessel that the heart is pumping blood down to the hand. We're going to close it off, and then I'm slowly going to let the pressure out to release the pressure in the cuff, and we're going to get to a point where the blood is just able to push through the cuff. And at that point, that's when the force of the heart is equal to the force of the cuff. And so we can measure that blood pressure. So if you're watching here, so we're going to set this up, and I'm going to start pumping. Is it getting tight on your arm? Okay, and then I'm going to slowly start letting the air out. Awesome. Again, let me turn so you can see here maybe a little bit closer of what we've done. And we're just going to shrink this a little bit here. So hopefully you can kind of see this where you're viewing. This green line that's up at the top, and this is maybe the harder one to see here, but this is the pressure that's in the cuff. And so you can see the green line kind of follows along at a very low level, and then here you can see I pumped the pressure up, and then I started to release the pressure. So this green line comes back down. And the microphone that I stuck up in there, well, first it's making a lot of noise because I'm pumping the cuff up. But as soon as I stop pumping, you can see that the blue signal gets very quiet. It gets very quiet. And essentially, that's because there's no blood coming past the cuff. But as I continue to let the pressure down, suddenly you'll start to see these little spikes start to appear. And each of these little spikes is a little gush of blood, gush, 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 coming through the cuff. And that's that. At the point at which that happens, I can look up the pressure, and that is equal to the force that our heart is trying to generate. So that's a couple things we've measured. We've measured heart rate, we've measured the volume of blood that the heart is pumping, and we've measured the force of the blood that's doing that. And so we do all of that while people are on the bike or on a treadmill or, at minus 30 degrees or plus 30 degrees in the chamber or even at 21,000 feet. That's all the type of research that we do. Thanks, Katie, for your help here. Looking at time, maybe I'll open it up now because I know there's probably some interesting questions. Now that you've kind of seen how we measure these things, what sort of questions do you have for me?
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much, Katie. That was very interesting. We have questions that are coming in fast and furious over Twitter, so I'll shoot off a couple of those. So you talked a little bit about, and this comes from Kirthana from Glen Forest Secondary School, and she's wondering the difference between someone exercising regularly and then maybe like an athlete, and then someone that doesn't regularly exercise. How does that affect the heartbeat between those two people? What's the difference?
Well, so I'm sure we've all heard that exercise is good for you, and specifically that exercise is good for your heart. And so one of the things that exercise does is it helps to lower your blood pressure. And so if you remember, what we just did is that we learned that when we measure someone's blood pressure, that's measuring the force that their heart has to work to pump blood. And when you exercise, because the heart has to pump blood to your muscles, your blood pressure will go up. And that's, unless you have a very specific condition, that's okay. It's healthy for your blood pressure to go up for a short period of time when you exercise. It's like weight training for your heart, right? You lift weights, you lift heavy weights when you go to the gym to make your muscles strong. Well, if you run or ski or bike, your heart works harder and it gets stronger. So that means the rest of the day, when you're just doing things, at school or, at home, that your heart, because it's stronger, it's working at a relatively easier effort than it might normally be if you didn't exercise. So exercise helps to make your heart strong and helps to lower your blood pressure. The other thing that will happen, because your heart, when you exercise, it not only gets stronger, but it'll actually get bigger. Just like, bodybuilders, and they go to the gym, they have giant muscles. Your heart will get bigger, not huge. It's not going to burst out of your chest, but it does get bigger. And so that may actually mean that when you're not exercising, you might have a lower heart rate than the average person. I told you that, roughly an average heart rate for a normal person might be between 60 to 100 beats per minute. Well, for some athletes we know that have giant hearts, their resting heart rate could be as low as 30 to 40 beats per minute, right? So when your heart rate is beating about this fast, their heart is going about boom, 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 because it's so big and it's pumping so much blood that it just can get away with only beating once every 2 seconds.
Okay.
That was a great question.
So along that same vein, also from Glen Forest in Mississauga, is it important then to warm up before you do any vigorous exercise? And what effect does warming up have on your heart rate once you do start to exercise?
Warming up is certainly a great thing for athletes or just people that go to exercise, and it does a lot of things beyond just the heart. I mean, just to give you a very quick example, when you warm up, right? And by warm up, I mean maybe you do a bit of light exercise, you jog around the gym, or go for a little spin on the bike, or just play your activity very lightly. It helps to warm up your muscles. It loosens up your joints. But in terms of the heart, it will get your heart rate up. Right, so you saw when Katie got on the treadmill, it raised her heart rate up from maybe 70, 80 beats per minute up to 130, 140, and so that starts to get the blood going. It gets the oxygen to the blood to the muscles, and then if you're about to say start a competition, if your heart rate's already elevated and ready to go, it means that the blood and oxygen is going to get to your muscles a lot faster the minute you start, as opposed to if you were sitting on a couch and went from 60 beats per minute heart rate and had to take that time to get your heart rate up to the level you need.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about the effect of the environment that you were mentioning, whether it's the altitude or the temperature maybe? This comes from Vivian at Glen Forest Secondary School as well.
Sure. So, I'll put you back here so you can see the little room here to give you some context. The biggest effect upon your heart rate is probably going to be in a hot environment instead of a cold environment. And the reason for that is when you're exercising in the heat, you sweat. And when you sweat, that water that ends up on your skin and some of it evaporates into the air, that water had to come from somewhere. And a lot of it comes from the water that makes up your blood. And so you can imagine someone who's out, running a marathon on a really hot day, and they're sweating, profusely. And even though they might be drinking some, you're never going to be able to replenish the water that you lose. And so it's quite possible people could lose 2, 3, maybe more liters of water from their body. The result is, again, thinking back to how the heart works as a pump, if the amount of blood being delivered to the heart starts to decrease because you have less volume in your blood, then that will mean the only way your heart's going to be able to try to keep the system going is it's going to pump faster and faster and faster. And so on a hot day, you might be running along and your heart rate might be initially, let's say it's 150 beats per minute. But as you start to sweat and become dehydrated, your heart rate's going to start to creep upward, 155, 160, 165. And as your heart rate goes higher, you've only got so much room, right? Most people can't get their heart rate over about 200 beats per minute. That's your limit. That's going as hard as you possibly can. So as your heart rate starts to go higher and higher and higher, you're going to reach a point where you're like, I just can't keep this pace up. Even if your running speed hasn't changed, you're running that marathon, it's because you're losing the blood volume that's delivering the essential oxygen to your muscles. And so that's why on a hot day, it's always feels harder to exercise, and it isn't. And it's why it's so important to make sure you stay hydrated and drink your water when you're outside to keep your blood volume up so your heart doesn't have to work as hard.
So obviously the blood, it pumps oxygen to the muscles that need it, but our lungs are responsible for the intake of oxygen in the first place, right? So there must be a very close interplay between the lung and the heart health. Is that true? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, definitely. Right. Recall when we looked inside the heart, there's two sides to it. There's the left side, the bigger side of your heart, and it's responsible for pumping the blood to your muscles. But the other side of the heart, the right side, pumps the blood to the lungs. And that's important because we have to pick up when we take a breath of air in, you have to send blood to the lungs to pick up the oxygen and then bring it back to the heart so that the left side can pump it to the rest of the body. And so one of the neat connections between the heart and the lungs, beyond just that the two have to work together. You can't just have a pump continuing to work. You have to find a way to get the oxygen in. But there's a very neat connection, and I'll use an example that some of my students will sometimes do this little exercise. If you've ever done yoga or maybe even better than this, let's say you're extremely frustrated and your teacher is saying, "Hey, slow down, take a deep breath and relax," right? And maybe a couple deep breaths. Take 2 deep breaths and relax. And so when you do that, right, you fill up your lungs, big, slow, deep breath in, and then you take a slow, deep breath out. And you can try this right now. One of the neat things that happens there is the connection between your brain and your heart senses the time when you take that big, deep breath of air in. And during that time when you're breathing in, the heart rate will actually accelerate. And it's not by a few beats. Your heart rate might jump from, say, 60 beats per minute to 100 beats per minute during the period when you breathe in. And then when you go to breathe out, the heart rate slows down. It might go back from 100 back down to, say, 40 beats per minute. It drops right down. The whole point of that is your heart and your brain, they realize when you have a breath of air coming in, you've got all this fresh oxygen filling up your lungs, and your heart says, okay, let's send as much blood as we can there to pick up all this oxygen. And then when you breathe out, the heart says, okay, it's like riding a bike. We're going down the hill now. I don't need to send any blood to the lungs. There's no air in there. I'm breathing out. So let's slow the heart rate down. And it's very easy to see that when you have someone who does very deep, slow breathing. You have a huge change in the heart rate. It speeds up and slows down as you breathe in and you breathe out. And that's part of the reason why if you do meditation or yoga, the slow, deep breathing feels so good. You get this huge boost of oxygen into your bloodstream and your brain goes, that's better. And you calm down and you relax. Some of the stuff we're doing is we're trying to seize that mechanism actually at work when you exercise. It's a much trickier thing to do because when you're at rest and you're breathing slowly, everything happens very slowly. It's easy to see that. When you have someone running on a treadmill, not only are they moving, but their heart is beating at 200 beats per minute. So these changes happen very, very quickly. So it's a trickier thing to measure, but we're trying to do so. Great question.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just continue with as much time that we have here. Kirthana from Glen Forest asks again, so why is it important, and you're kind of just talking about this, but why is it important to cool down after exercise, like physically speaking?
Well, cooling down, I'll give you a good example of someone's running a race and they're going as hard as they can to the finish line, sprinting, and their heart rate is racing at 200 beats per minute. And you kind of think about what's happening there. The heart is responsible for pumping the blood away from the heart. What's responsible for getting the blood back to the heart? Well, part of that is the muscles, right? When you're running as fast as you can, the muscles, you have your leg muscles and your thigh and your lower leg, they're contracting very rhythmically, and they actually kind of work, you kind of picture like milking a cow is sort of how the leg muscles work to pump the blood back up to the heart. And so you go to that runner who is sprinting towards the finish line of the race, their heart is beating maximally, their legs are moving very quickly and forcefully. It's a good system. They're getting the blood going as fast as it can, and then they get to the finish line and they stop. They stop moving. Well, one of the things that we know that happens is sometimes the athletes will go, I feel really dizzy and lightheaded, and maybe they even pass out. And that's because all the blood from the heart is going down towards the legs, but the legs have stopped pushing it back up. And so much so that, we're not even getting enough blood up to our brain. That is what keeps us conscious and alert. And so you sometimes see people who are going really, really hard and they pass out at the finish line. And so for that reason, if you're doing really intense exercise, going very hard, try not to just stop cold turkey. When you get to the finish line, maybe walk it out. Keep your legs moving. And that helps to keep the blood coming back, helps to slow everything down. Keeps you from passing out.
Yep. Okay, maybe time for one or two more. So Dana and Cameron from Spencer Avenue Elementary School have a very good question as well. They want to know how your diet and what you eat can change, can affect your heart.
Okay, so a really good example here, and you probably heard this is kind of the opposite of, you hear people saying exercise is good for your heart, it helps to lower your blood pressure, and then they'll say don't eat too much salt in your diet because salt is bad for your heart. So how does that work? Well, the salt kind of works opposite to my example of that person who's running a marathon on a hot day. And on a hot day, and you sweat and you lose water from your blood, so the heart has to beat faster in order to keep the blood flowing to the muscles. Well, for a person who has too much salt in their diet, and when you eat a lot of salt, it's your kidneys that have to get rid of the salt. And there's, the kidneys are trying to keep the concentration of salt in your bloodstream at a certain level. And one way they'll do that is if you've got a lot of salt, they'll put water into your bloodstream, right? To basically dilute it, right? If you've ever had, orange juice or some sort of a drink that's too sweet or too salty, right? You add some water to it and it dilutes it and you're like, that's just about right. That's kind of what the kidneys will do. The problem with that is when you add more water into your blood than you normally should have, the vessels start to swell, right? There's more than the system can handle, and that is going to force the heart to work stronger, right? And that, if the heart is working stronger, it drives the blood pressure up. And it's not healthy to have a high blood pressure because it means over time, days, months, years, your heart is having to work so much harder than it should. And the other problem that comes with if there's too much water is normally we think of the heart as being a very soft, elastic muscle, and the vessels that come out of the heart as being soft and elastic, kind of like a balloon. Well, if you're constantly having to deal with a lot of force and a lot of volume, the vessels get stiff and they get rigid, and that's not a great thing because it makes them less able to change over time, and so that further adds to the higher blood pressure and the work the heart has to do. So, there's other things maybe in your diet, maybe too much cholesterol. We could talk about, what that does. But the biggest thing, I think, for heart health is having too much salt, which is the opposite of being dehydrated, right? The two are just the same mechanism. Great question.
Yeah. So there's certainly lots of things that factor into a good heart, I think, is the takeaway there. The one thing I like to ask all researchers is what advice or suggestions would you like to pass on to our students who may be interested in studying heart health in post-secondary education, perhaps?
Well, if you're interested in the heart, right, there's so many areas where you could be involved, or think of a career in the heart, right? You could be maybe be teaching about human physiology, doing some of the work that I do, or maybe you're involved in research and studying how the heart works or measuring changes in the heart with different people. Perhaps you work more in a health profession. And so you could be, there's heart surgeons and there's cardiologists that, doctors who only deal with the heart because it's such an important organ. We can't, you can live without one kidney, you can lose part of your liver, we can, take out your gallbladder, your appendix, but it's really difficult to live with a damaged heart. And so there's surgeons that are working to help, improve the quality of life. You might also be involved, let's say someone that has heart disease or has had a heart attack, there's been some damage to the heart. You might be involved in the rehabilitation of of an individual after they've had some sort of an incident or when they've been diagnosed. For example, a physiotherapist or a kinesiologist might work in a hospital or might work in a gym, and they would essentially do exercise training for the heart. And so that would involve, you would have people come in maybe after they've had a heart attack, you'd have them on a treadmill or on a bike, and they would be doing some exercises. You'd have to carefully measure their heart rate and their blood pressure to make sure they're staying at a safe level, because remember, too high blood pressure means your heart's working too hard, and if you've got a heart condition, we got to be careful about that. And so those physiotherapists and kinesiologists would work kind of indirectly with the heart, with the people, to try to get their heart stronger, to lower their blood pressure, to get them more comfortable doing things like walking upstairs and getting around town. You might be also involved that there's scientists that work in the chemistry and the pharmacology, developing new drugs that can try to lower the blood pressure or change how the rhythm of the heart. If you've got someone, instead of their heart beating at a normal rate, it kind of beats erratically and skips heartbeats, and you can treat that with medication. So lots of areas you can be involved, certainly.
Okay. That's certainly good to know. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for today. So I'd like to say thank you again to all of our live stream viewers, and of course to you, Dr. Raymer, for taking the time to answer our questions and share your expertise with us today. Thank you to Katie as well for being our lab rep for the day. That was very good. Our next PIR live event is January 20th at 1 p.m. with Dr. Thomas Merritt from Laurentian University. We'll discuss his genomics research with fruit flies and answer your questions about that topic at that time. So thank you again, Dr. Raymer.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye for now.